A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have all of you here and to see so many new faces. It's a testament to the drawing power of our speaker. I'll introduce our distinguished speaker for the evening in a minute. Let me start with a couple of housekeeping points, if I may. First, my name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm the director of the Center for International and Regional Studies here at Georgetown. I see a lot of new faces, a lot of students. Tomorrow, incidentally, for those of you who are not at Georgetown, is the last day of classes for the current semester. So if you see students walking around with big smiles on their faces, that's why. If I could ask that you please turn off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Doha traffic being what it is, we expect people to arrive a little late. And so if I could ask you to sit closer to each other and a little friendlier in case there are others who come late. A summary of tonight's talk will be available on our website within the week. The website is cirs.georgetown.edu. For those of you who are just joining us for the first time, there's a sign-in sheet just outside the double doors. If you could leave your contact info with us, we will do our best to get in touch with you for our next event. Our next event actually will be in either end of August or the beginning of September. We will be going on our summer hiatus where we actually rethink our functions and everything that we're doing. So this is the last monthly dialogue talk of the academic year, and you will see in a minute that we have saved the best for last. Abdullah Al-Arian is a good friend and one of most well-informed and one of the best professors here at Georgetown University in Qatar. He is assistant professor of history. He is a Hoya through and through. He has his PhD from Georgetown in history, and he is the author of his first book, which is Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt, published by Oxford University Press. He is currently working on a second book on the Muslim Brotherhood in the rest of the Middle East. And most importantly, something that we here at CIRS take tremendous pride in is the fact that he is also the Georgetown Faculty Fellow for the academic year at the Center for International and Regional Studies. So please join me in welcoming Abdullah Al-Arian. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Kamrava, to everyone here at CIRS for inviting me back. This is the second time I've done a monthly dialogue. And also thank you, of course, for the faculty fellowship this year that has allowed me to continue to do the kind of research that I'm hoping to present to you this evening. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I see a lot of students here. It's really great that you could make it as well, given I know that this is now the final season. And so what I'm excited to share with you tonight is a new book project that I've been working on for several years now. It's an ambitious research project that's taken me to more than 10 countries around the region and even beyond to conduct field work and explore what I think is an important question that impacts how we think about the role that Islamist movements may play in the changes that are currently underway in large parts of the Arab region. And so what I hope to do tonight is to share with you the basic premise of this new project and provide you, I guess, with a sneak preview, and then solicit your feedback and questions that you think that are raised by this research. And so as we sit here in the spring of 2017, observing the dismal state of things in our region, The hopefulness of the moment that emerged in the spring of 2011, when decades-old authoritarian regimes were on the brink of collapse, seems like a distant memory. But if you'd indulge me, I'd like to take a moment to take us back to that moment just 6 years ago. By this time, in mid-April of 2011, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali of Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak of Egypt had been overthrown by mass uprisings in their respective countries. The regimes of Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya were on the verge of collapse, and Bashar al-Assad was facing the largest threat to his rule in the form of a largely peaceful protest movement. The monarchical rulers of Jordan, Morocco, and Bahrain had similarly witnessed popular mobilizations in the form of ordinary citizens demanding the restoration of their dignity and the recognition of their collective rights. In short, scholars, journalists, and citizen observers alike, both within the Arab region and across the world, were witnessing what they believed to be the dawn of a new era in the Middle East, one signified by an end to dictatorship and the rise of representative governments, equal citizenship, and respect for the rule of law. But no sooner had the discussions about the post-authoritarian transition to democracy emerged that the conversation shifted once again, this time to the question of what role Islamist movements would play in nation-states freed from the top-down imposition of secularism. Some critics warned that the vacuum left by secular authoritarian rulers would simply be filled by a new tyranny in the form of political Islam. As political parties representing the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought popped up in one country after another and proved to be the social movement most capable of exploiting the country's nascent political opening, the Arab Spring, it was suggested, would give way to an Islamist winter, in which these parties undermined notions of national citizenship and ended and eroded state borders, culminating in the unification of Muslim Brotherhood movements from Morocco to Yemen, and perhaps even bringing about the restoration of the caliphate. Of course, anyone who closely followed the post-uprising developments in places like Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen knew this to be a complete fallacy. Parties like the Ennahda movement in Tunisia, the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, the Justice and Construction Party in Libya, and the Islah Party in Yemen were far more focused on their respective domestic affairs than on fulfilling the goals of some abstract, transnational, and ideological and political project. In fact, the posture of these parties over the course of the past several years has only confirmed what has been plain to see for some time, that traditional Islamist groups that emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought have adapted their missions to their local political and socioeconomic contexts. Now, the way that events have since unfolded, from the military coup in Egypt to the civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, have derailed this conversation somewhat. But as a historian by training, I have the luxury of taking the long view of things, and so I propose to revisit our understanding of Islamism with an eye toward its nationalist inclinations. That's essentially the question that this project is asking. If we look back at history, at the history of a transnational movement on the order of the Muslim Brotherhood, recognized by most people as the prototypical representative of the phenomenon of political Islam, what would its relationship be to its respective national contexts in every place that it appeared? Is there one version of al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, or are there many? If there are indeed many Ikhwanisms, as it were, how does the national context determine what shape they've taken through the years? I'd argue that there are several reasons at the current moment presents a critical juncture in our need to reassess our understanding of Islamist movements. First, by looking back at the past through a fresh lens, we come away with a different image of the historical legacy of political Islam, one that would have led observers to draw vastly different conclusions about their ability or even their desire to form transnational bonds in a post-authoritarian order. Secondly, in the face of a growing regional and global insurgency by groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, it is perhaps more important now than ever to distinguish between different strands of political Islam. Those that have by and large remained within the modernist Islamic tradition with its acceptance of nation states, and those that have categorically rejected the designation of states in favor of a radically different political order. Finally, this is also a worthwhile moment to re-examine the role of Islamist movements because of the continuing possibilities they hold for the future of a region that is currently in the midst of one of the most turbulent eras in modern history. If one looks around, there's a starkly different picture emerging depending on whether we examine the role of these movements in contexts like Morocco, Jordan, Kuwait, Tunisia, or their more highly contentious role in countries like Libya, Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. This is particularly crucial in light of the blanket designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization by several regional powers, a position that has been openly lauded by the current US administration. So in light of the chronic lack of contextualization that dominates much of the policy debate around the question of Islamism, I would put forward the argument that the Muslim Brotherhood is a specific brand of Islamism with roots in the early 20th century Islamic modernist tradition, should be viewed as a nationalist force whose mobilization campaigns cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader developments within the state-building projects of the 19th and 20th centuries in the Middle East. So what I'm essentially suggesting here is to write Islamists back into the nationalist histories of Arab states. I believe there are several reasons why these expressions of political Islam have been largely excluded from nationalist narratives across the Arab region. I think all of these are problematic, but I'll list each of them briefly and then offer my critique. The first of these is conceptual. That is, the ways in which scholars have defined nationalism has tended to exclude any movements or ideologies that place religious identity at the core of their program. Secondly, one could point to the historiography of Arab societies that privileges state-centered narratives and has tended to marginalize the voice of non-state actors that did not exercise political power during the critical phases of state building and national identity formation. Thirdly, one can also look at the posture of the movements themselves, which have historically disavowed any relationship to the nationalist movement and developed an ideological program that was committed to countering the dominant nationalist paradigms in their respective contexts. And a final point, which I may not have time to get to today, concerns the geopolitical calculations made by Western powers in the post-colonial era as to what or who constituted a nationalist. Instead, I hope to conclude by showcasing a few examples from my fieldwork and how context matters in our understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood's various shapes and trajectories. So first, onto the conceptual question. Theories of nationalism emerged in the modern period to attempt to explain the process by which people were bound together by a collective identity, and in turn, the ways in which that collective identity tied them to a state structure. The process of identity formation developed over a period of time, and in most cases would become territorially bound. According to Ernest Gellner, this process was a direct outcome of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent homogenization of culture to a set of common symbols and, at its core, language. Anthony Smith pushed this notion further, arguing that nations were modern constructs made up of several criteria, among them a common mythology, shared history and culture, and strong bonds of solidarity tied to a particular geographic location. Although Smith traces the process of national identity formation through the political, economic, and cultural revolutions of the 19th century Europe, he does allow for what he calls ethnic, genealogical conceptions of the nation in non-Western societies. But it was really Benedict Anderson who began to problematize nationalism as not only imagined, but imagined in the self-image of Western industrial societies, resulting in nationalist movements in the colonized world that often tended to appropriate the same criteria for their nationalist projects as their colonizers. The role of religion, for instance, which had become subsumed under a broad set of categories that defined European national identities, meant that any movement that defined itself in religious terms, as many did in the 19th century, from Abdul Qadir in Algeria to the Mahdi in Sudan, could not possibly have resisted colonial intrusions on the basis of nationalist inclinations, according to these narrow definitions put forward by scholars. Neither, for that matter, could the Muslim Brotherhood of interwar Egypt have qualified as a nationalist force, even as it advocated for a new ethical basis around which to organize the state and society in the early years after Egyptian independence. And so this brings me to my next point, which is that the development of powerful state-centered historical narratives of the Middle East during the 19th century that tends to exclude religiously inspired movements and reformers in favor of secular reformers who instituted European modernization policies within their societies. So modernizers, from Mustafa Rashid Pasha in the Ottoman Empire to Muhammad Ali in Egypt, launched efforts to reform their militaries, their legal codes, their education systems, and taxation policies, among other things. But quite often, these policies continued under the auspices of colonial rule by British and French administrators. Given Europe's changing relationship with the role of religion in its own societies, and its historical hostility to Islam in particular, it was no surprise that some religious practices would be marginalized in Muslim societies undergoing modernization. Reformers like Muhammad Abdu confronted these developments by adapting traditional Islamic institutions to the challenges of modern life. Though he was a senior Azhari scholar and rose to become the Mufti of Egypt at the turn of the century, Abdu represented a minority of religious officials, many of whom tended to hold to classical interpretations of Islamic law. So the official historiography follows the core group of Abdu's disciples who formed Egypt's nationalist movement, people like Saad Zaghlul and Mustafa Kamil, while minimizing the role of his other followers who continued to agitate for greater representation of Islamic values in a rapidly changing society, especially following the 1924 abolition of the caliphate, which was, of course, the symbol of religious and political authority in the Islamic world that had stood for 13 centuries. That overlooked line within the genealogy of modernist Islamic reformers continues from Muhammad Abdu to Rashid Rida, and soon after to Hassan al-Banna, a school teacher born in an Egyptian village and educated, it should be mentioned, at Cairo's Dar al-Ulum, one of the country's modern institutions of higher learning. Banna founded the Society of the Muslim Brothers in 1928. With the opening up of political space during the interwar period, the Muslim Brotherhood positioned itself as a movement that preached social reforms, supporting the country's continued modernization while adhering to Islamic principles. At a time when there appeared to be an increasing divide between the country's political and religious elites, and the latter seemed incapable of challenging their effective marginalization, Banna believed that ordinary people could advocate on behalf of their religious ideals. Throughout the so-called liberal experiment in Egypt, Banna focused the bulk of his energies to working within the bounds of the emerging Egyptian state. He wrote letters to King Farouk, he challenged the Liberal Weft Party in parliamentary elections, and he even held talks with British colonial officials. But as the Muslim Brotherhood represented a religious movement seemingly opposed to the liberalizing effects of state building, much of that history exists on the margins of Egypt's official historiography. This is not to say that scholars have completely ignored the role of Islam in shaping national identity. On the contrary, the literature on Arab nationalism is replete with examinations of 20th century nationalist thinkers and political leaders like Abdul Rahman al-Bazzaz or Sati al-Husri and Michel Aflaq, all of whom believed strongly in the role of Islam as a cultural force that was crucial in shaping Arab national identity. But inasmuch as Islam was judged to have played a critical role in shaping national identity, the line was drawn at Islamism, which was viewed at best as a marginal force in society, and at worst as a voice of active opposition to nationalist movements. So consequently, just as these official histories place secular Arab leaders at the center of the story of Arab nationalism, early studies of Islamism also tended to isolate these movements from the broader nationalist narratives. While they offered critical contributions to the understanding of the rise of Islamism as a consequence of modern developments, these studies ultimately concluded that such movements represented an aberration from the broader march of secular nationalism. And so here I would raise the third point, which is that inasmuch as the dominant narrative has excluded the impact of religiously inspired movements on the greater nationalist cause, so too have Islamists themselves consistently distinguished themselves from anything approaching a vision of nationalism. In the very roots of its ideology, the Muslim Brotherhood disavows the notion of nationalism as a narrow designation meant to undermine the bonds of Islamic solidarity that transcend artificially constructed physical borders and cultural boundaries. Banna's speeches are replete with references to nationalism as a tool of Western colonialism to carve up and exploit Muslim lands. And by no means has that message been limited to the first half of the 20th century. One wouldn't have to look far to find instances of contemporary Islamist leaders continuing to disavow nationalist sentiments as a harmful distraction from the most pressing crises in the Muslim world, from Palestine's continued occupation to the invasion and occupation of countries like Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Iraq. But here I would suggest that it's imperative to examine not only the words of Islamist movements as represented in their official ideological programs, but to examine the deeds of these movements as well in the course of their everyday political action, as well as the structural developments within the movements themselves. So despite its intellectual claims to upholding a particular Islamic orthodoxy, the Muslim Brotherhood was not a traditional movement seeking to recreate the political and social structures of a bygone. It maintained an intricate structure with elected representatives at local levels. Even as Benna's movement used Islamic terminologies for its various institutions, it functioned much like a community association or a modern political party. Although he critiqued the partisanship of Egypt's liberal experiment, he nevertheless himself stood in parliamentary elections on multiple occasions. His followers continued to advocate for a political and socioeconomic order that reflected Islamic ethical values. They pushed for censorship of objectionable content in books and films, they lobbied banks to forego the use of interest, and they demanded that the parliament be required to pass laws only in accordance with Islamic legal principles. In other words, all of their activism was built around the movement's acceptance of the social structures and state institutions that were premised upon nationalist identification. In the second half of the 20th century, as many Arab states transformed into secular military dictatorships, social movements of all ideological stripes were largely repressed. Islamist movements were considered the most threatening to many Arab rulers and their foreign sponsors for a number of reasons. Because they appealed to a deeper sense of religious identity, Islamists were thought to have consistently undermined the narrower and more artificially constructed secular nationalism promoted by regimes within their society. The agendas of Islamist movements were also diametrically opposed to the aims of the states they sought to influence, from the calls for democratization and religiously inspired reforms to the demands for a foreign policy that challenged foreign intervention in the region and promoted solidarity with oppressed Muslim populations. Many Islamist groups were also singled out for persecution due to a perception, in many cases a self-fulfilling one, that they would challenge the state militarily. Sayyid Qutb's impassioned contribution to the ideological development of Islamist thought during the 1960s endorsed a far more confrontational path in terms of addressing the excesses of state repression. For Qutb's part in the escalation of Islamist rhetoric against military rule, the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser had him executed in 1966. So in sharp contrast to the mainline Islamism promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood and its regional offshoots, some of Qutb's supporters would then go on to develop a vision of Islamist activism that rejected the notion of gradual reform through existing state institutions. Instead, they sought to develop a truly transnational movement that overturned these structures through militant violence, if need be, in favor of a purely Islamic order. Spurred on by the Afghan jihad in the 1980s, this trend found currency in rallying disaffected youth to confront foreign intervention and domestic repression from the mid-1990s. Jihadists represent a significant counterpoint to the gradual reformism and state-centered activism of mainline Islamists, and continue to find currency in parts of the region, like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, suffering from military conflict and the collapse of functional state institutions. Indeed, I would contend that a primary reason why Islamist groups continued to disavow any nationalist aspirations through the end of the 20th century was due to the fact that national identity formation was purely the domain of secular authoritarians. So as long as Hosni Mubarak defined what it meant to be Egyptian, the Muslim Brotherhood simply wanted no part of it. But as soon as the space was created for movements and parties to debate and discuss what it meant to be Egyptian, you find that there was no more enthusiastic participant than the Muslim Brotherhood. If we think back to the opening that occurred just after Mubarak's fall in February of 2011, every event for the Freedom and Justice Party, from their press conferences and political rallies to campaign events and street protests, all featured the singing of the Egyptian national anthem and prominent displays of the Egyptian flags and other symbols of national identity. This was far from an overnight development or an instance of momentary opportunism. Rather, the lesson from the latter half of the 20th century is that ideology does not tell us the full story, and that undue emphasis on it risks leading analysts into drawing the wrong conclusions. The evolution of Islamist movements cannot be divorced from their local political and social contexts. In most instances, this involved early acceptance of the legitimacy of state institutions, a deep commitment to gradual institutional reform, and an underlying belief in the national identity formation process, irrespective of its usage to prop up neo-colonial or secular authoritarian regimes. In the development of their public discourse, allusions to the establishment of an Islamic state or the implementation of the Sharia have been largely subsumed under discussions of constitutional reforms, political pluralism, and citizenship rights. Even in instances where the movement departed from the gradualist approach, it was usually necessitated by domestic conditions. Long before the Syrian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood led an armed insurrection against the brutal regime of Hafiz al-Assad in the early 1980s, it regularly participated in the Syrian political process during the brief opening, allowing it to compete for parliamentary representation. In echoes of that earlier confrontation, the movement's decision to challenge the regime of al-Assad's son Bashar in 2011, the movement clearly adapted its organizational mission to the national context and joined in the broader opposition to authoritarian rule. Similarly, in the Palestinian context, Islamists had long dedicated their energies to the practice of da'wah, or religious preaching, within their communities, as opposed to confronting the question of Israel's continued occupation. But seeing their stock within Palestinian society remain low when compared with liberal and leftist currents, by the late 1980s, Palestinian Islamists resolved to join the struggle for national liberation, eventually adopting the path of armed struggle, leading to the Muslim Brotherhood's establishment of the Islamic resistance movement, known, of course, by its acronym as Hamas. In Sudan, the movement led by scholar and activist Hassan al-Turabi alternately pursued its mission at times through appeals to popular mobilization and at other times through supporting the military's takeover of power, as in the 1989 coup led by Omar al-Bashir. Turabi justified both approaches on the basis of Sudan's unique historical circumstances, including the need to challenge prevailing cultural and religious practices and erode a persistent colonial legacy. The Kuwaiti branch of the Muslim Brotherhood earned the ire of many of its sister movements around the region when it endorsed the American-led intervention to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi occupation that followed Saddam Hussein's invasion in 1990, a move that the organization justified on the basis of national interest. In Jordan, the movement historically positioned itself as an ally of the Hashemite monarchy. Until recently, the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood enjoyed relatively good relations with the state, being careful to distance itself from the more ambitious political objectives of other Muslim Brotherhood branches in neighboring countries. In both of those cases, the evolution of an Islamist movement under a monarchical system has necessitated a total reformulation of the Muslim Brotherhood's core ideological platform. In this case, the notion of Islamization of the political system being completely acceptable under the auspices of a ruling monarchy. But shifting back to Egypt, in spite of its historic conflict with the regime, by the early 2000s, the Muslim Brotherhood had managed to carve for itself a comfortable place within Egyptian society. It offered essential social services such as schools and clinics, while continuing to press the government for democratic reforms. To quell rising domestic and international pressure, the Mubarak regime eventually paved the way for the Muslim Brotherhood, officially a banned organization in Egypt, to send its members into the People's Assembly, allotting it 88 seats in the 2005 parliamentary elections. By the eve of the Arab uprisings, most Islamist movements across the region had adopted a reformist, state-centered approach to their activism. They situated themselves purely within the context of their respective national politics, a far cry from Banna's original universalist mission and pan-Islamic outlook. As newly founded Islamist parties in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya vied for votes in a nascent democratic order, it became increasingly apparent that these movements would have to continue to adapt to their rapidly changing landscapes or risk becoming relics of a bygone era of oppositional politics in the Arab world. Not only did the toppling of one dictator after another free Islamist groups to fully embrace the state institutions that they had spent decades critiquing, they also incorporated nationalist slogans and symbols into their programs. The Ennahda party in Tunisia had already distinguished itself years earlier by adopting a decidedly democratic platform that focused on promoting a pluralistic political system in its local context, in contrast to other brotherhood-based parties. But in the years since the fall of Ben Ali's regime in Tunisia, Ennahda has further developed its unique model for the next era of Islamist political organizing. At its 10th Party Congress in 2015, Ennahda's Rashid al-Ghannouchi announced that the movement was formally splitting its traditional social mission and religious preaching, or da'wah, from its political party. As the party's leaders proudly declared, they were becoming, quote, Muslim Democrats, an allusion to the Christian democratic parties that dot the landscape of European political systems. Ennahda's announcement represents a crucial acknowledgement that there was simply no place for the old model mid-20th century Islamic activism in today's world. In the post-Mubarak transition, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood found itself tremendously isolated by continuing to rely on its traditional base of support for political mobilization, rather than attempt to convince a broader swath of the Egyptian public to support the FJP. It also faced internal hostility for depriving group members the freedom to form their own political preferences. Mohamed Morsi's candidacy, which reversed a promise by the Muslim Brotherhood leaders not to field a presidential candidate in 2012, was in large part a response to the candidacy of Abdul Min'am Abu al-Futuh, a former Brotherhood leader who left the group to launch his own political career. In the aftermath of the coup in Egypt, reformist figures within the Muslim Brotherhood have grown more vocal about the need to sever the organization's political activism from its missionary work. Such a measure, they contend, would preserve the purity of the group's social mission from the muddy waters of national politics. Similar efforts have been discussed and quietly underway by Islamist parties across the Arab world, the result of major internal as well as external pressures. Such a transformation, complete with the explicit adoption of a nationalist platform, is necessary for these movements to engage in formal politics, especially in a post-authoritarian order. In 1994, French scholar Olivier Roy published a book entitled The Failure of Political Islam. In it, he argued that the inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to offer a true alternative from the post-colonial political structures that emerged in the Arab region constituted a failure of these movements, leading him to declare that rather than Islamism, what we should really be talking about is Islamo-nationalism. If we take that argument to its conclusion, the evolution of Ennahda and its integration into the secular Tunisian state system would therefore constitute a total dilution of the Ikhwanism to which it had supposedly been beholden. Another way of looking at these developments, though, is that in the same way that Islamists have become nationalized, so too have nationalists attempted to Islamize their agendas in their desperate pursuit of legitimacy. So what is truly ironic is that as Islamist parties gradually acquire a more, quote, secular outlook to their interpretation of the needs of contemporary democratic politics, several authoritarian rulers have increasingly begun to employ traditional Islamic arguments to justify their hold on power. Ali Goma, the former Grand Mufti of Egypt and a vocal supporter of the Sisi regime's brutal crackdown on civilians, has routinely been called upon to justify the emergence of a new authoritarianism in Egypt as the fulfillment of a traditional requirement of classical promote political stability and obedience to one's ruler. These pronouncements by Goma and a coterie of other official jurists across the region signify that the debate around Islam and politics has really come full circle. The perceived failure of the state's religious establishment to represent the aspirations of believers in the face of tyranny is what inspired Benna to launch his movement nearly 1 century ago. But over the course of the past decade, Islamist groups have abandoned the slogan of Islam is the solution as a simplistic catchphrase in favor of an emphasis on particular values that their evolving interpretation of Islam promotes: freedom, consultative governance, and justice. Indeed, the challenges that the latest iteration of Islamist activism faces are the same ones that confront political parties of all ideological stripes, namely how to ensure that governments represent the interests of the majority of their citizens, especially at a time when more people face the dangers of a vast economic inequality and the lack of basic rights of freedom and security than at any other time in the recent past. So I'd like to conclude by raising a couple of possible critiques for the analysis that I just presented here. First, the notion that Islamist movements can and should adopt a nationalist paradigm through which to pursue their activist missions is challenged in a number of different contexts where religious identity represents a source of deep conflict and division within the states that lack religious homogeneity. The rise of so-called sectarian conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen ensure that Islamist politics are unlikely to represent a force of national unity, but rather a single side in a destructive conflict, with deep connections to the inflammatory escalation of sectarianized rhetoric among regional rivals. A second point raises a broader question about the utility of nationalism as an organizing political force in the age of what some might call post-nationalism, where Western societies have seen transnational governmental institutions as well as neoliberal economic arrangements, erode the power of nationalism as the preeminent organizing political force, while nationalistic reactions to these arrangements have largely been represented through xenophobic and nativist expressions, as we've seen in the recent Brexit vote and the rise of a certain president in the United States. But back to the region that concerns us for the moment. One can see this conflict playing out in ways that are not too dissimilar. The fracturing of national identities and the collapse of state institutions in some countries threatens to leave Arab societies facing one of two choices: the tyranny of revived authoritarian rule or the terror of a ruthless militant insurgency. Neither of these forces represents a viable path toward a stable future, but they nonetheless pose a deeper challenge to Islamist groups attempting to forge a movement for national conciliation. The Islamic State offers a vision of the Middle East free from the borders and national identities that reflect a legacy of colonial exploitation and authoritarian rule. The Assad regime imposes a narrow vision of Syrian nationalism that it aims to impose through brute force. This ensures that the challenge facing opposition movements around the region is to forge a third way, one that is inclusive and views national identity as a path toward popular empowerment of societies in a new political order. Thank you.
Abdullah, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so very much. That was terrific. I learned a great deal. Great. We have time for some questions. Are there any questions that you might have? Yes, Dr. Khadoui.
Thank you. I would like to ask, you didn't touch upon why the Muslim Brotherhood did not flourish in Saudi Arabia, and the reasons for that. And the second is, neither in Iraq at the present time. Could you please elaborate on both?
Sure, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say that it did not flourish in either of those contexts. I mean, there's a very rich history of a Muslim Brotherhood presence in Saudi Arabia. But I think, as you'll see, and this is dated back especially to the 1950s, especially with the exodus from Egypt that happened during the Nasser era. You had a lot of Egyptians that went there, and it gave roots and it gave life to a movement of the Muslim Brotherhood that spread, of course, within Saudi society and continues to be represented by a number of scholars and intellectuals that are based there. But I do think that there's an interesting model of how it takes shape in monarchical systems versus non-monarchical systems. And in the case of Saudi in particular, because it's a regime that really legitimizes itself on the basis of its own claims to religious authenticity in a way that perhaps some of the other Gulf regimes do not, I think that that also makes it more of a challenge to the rulers, which means that the nature of the activist mission of the Brotherhood in Saudi is far more limited and restricted to not being politically engaged, at least not in any kind of organized sense. As far as the Iraq case, there's also a rich legacy of a Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq. Of course, it was largely repressed in Iraq under Saddam as it was in Syria under the Assad regime. But I think what's interesting is when you look at the continuation of the Brotherhood movement within Iraq today, of course, it's not a particularly popular movement given the kind of sectarian divisions that exist and the way that the government that took shape in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion was far more heavily tilted in a way that encouraged sectarian sort of competition over political resources and power in ways that did not necessarily resonate with supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you end up with groups that, as we're seeing kind of unfold today, that are far more sectarian-minded in terms of their agendas. And I think that's the reason why it hasn't necessarily taken off in the same way.
Abdullah, building up on that, why is there no Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar?
It has a history in Qatar as well. And of course, we'd be remiss if we don't mention that Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who of course has made a home in Qatar, has been a leading Muslim Brotherhood intellectual and ideologue since the 1950s. And so it's not that there is not a presence here. I think what we've seen, of course, is that in many Gulf states, there's been a kind of accommodation between the movement, its leadership on the one hand, and the states. And I think, especially given the disparity between the foreign policies of different Gulf states, probably going back to the mid-1990s until now, we've seen that Qatar has been far more supportive of these movements in ways that some of its regional neighbors have not been.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in the back, yeah.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. That was a brilliant talk. In your analysis of Islamism, do you draw a distinction between Muslim Brotherhood movements and more Salafi movements?
Yeah, I do draw that distinction. I think Salafism as a term, of course, you could do an entire lecture just sort of on the genealogy of it, but there's sort of the modernist Salafi tradition, which is the one that I think the Muslim Brotherhood traces its lineage back to. There's a more literalist Salafi tradition, which I think is much more in line with the kind of Wahhabi movement that we see, especially in the Gulf. And then there's the sort of Salafi jihadist movements that have emerged far more recently than those. But if you take that kind of crude, categorization of three different types of Salafi movements, I would say that the Muslim Brotherhood is far more in the more traditional kind of modernist tradition that goes back to the late 19th century, people like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu. And the Salafi movements that emerged later have had an impact. And so there is definitely tremendous overlap. And I think we saw this especially in the chaos in Egypt after 2011, when so many different political parties were forming, that there were certain figures who you couldn't even peg them as Salafi or as Muslim Brotherhood because they embodied aspects of both of those different movements. And so we've definitely seen a tremendous impact of the Salafi movement on the Muslim Brotherhood's thought and its mission, specifically going back to the late 1970s.
Thank you, Mr. Asai.
Perceptibility of the exploitation of Islam and the religion has been, still is, and will be continued. Not only in Islam, but all religions. Now, with coping for Muslims, how do we encounter those exploiters that they are exploiting religion for their preordained agenda? And especially when moving forward, this particular concept, how is going to be the case in the Muslim world? For a better national identity, which will be Islam, and not any other foreign identity that we should identify with.
It's an important observation. I think that a lot of this has to do with the nature of how political power has been distributed for the better part of the past century, really. If we go all the way back to the kind of late colonial period, the rise of these kind of liberal elites that were largely westernized, and then follow that with the kind of radical regimes coming about mostly through Arab militaries, that we see that nowhere in those three periods do we ever see popular representation. We never see the actual reflection of the nature of what these societies look like, especially going back to the late Ottoman period. So I think that the first step, really, and it's the kind of most obvious one, and I think it's the one that brought about the Arab uprisings in 2011, was really to kind of restore the legitimacy back into the hands of popular rule, right? It's the idea of giving agency back to people in order to be able to represent their political aspirations in ways that don't necessitate taking on these kinds of identities, right? So Islamism emerged as a reaction to essentially the outlawing of religious politics or religious observance in popular society and in politics. If you remove those kinds of restrictions, chances are you're likely to find that those movements are no longer necessary. I think this is exactly the lesson from Nahda, is the moment that you get rid of a very aggressively secular regime, the first thing that Nahda sort of had to convince its followers, who of course had been fighting for this moment for a very long time, is that they didn't need to install the Sharia in the constitution. So that Nahda's representatives, during the discussions about what the future Tunisian constitution would look like, decided we don't need to mention the Sharia as a source of legislation. If this is already an Islamic society that reflects the values of the society, we don't need to actually state that overtly, and it doesn't need to be in our program, and it doesn't need to be in our state's constitution. And I think that's really kind of maybe your answer, is the fact that if you remove those kinds of restrictions, you'll find that the need to actually assert one's religious identity then all of a sudden gets swept away as well.
Thank you. Last question, yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Arian. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure that this project that you've been working on will be very useful for those who want to study Islamist, groups in the region. So my question here is, I'm not sure how related it is to your study, but what are your comments on Islamist organizations being labeled as terrorist
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I tried to kind of address at least briefly at the very beginning, which is to say that I think and I've been writing about this actually a lot more recently, especially as the debate within the US has been going on about whether the Trump administration is going to label the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization and what that means. And I think that the fact that it hasn't happened, at least in the 3 or 4 months so far, tells us something. It tells us that it's legally very tricky because no one knows how to define it. It's a movement that on the one hand is simply an intellectual trend, but it's also an organization, but it's an organization that has independent branches in so many different countries. It makes up members of government in places like Morocco and Tunisia and Jordan, places where the US ostensibly has, officials, ambassadors and consular officials who have to deal with those local governments. So from a legal standpoint, I think it's been determined that it's not exactly possible, logistically speaking, and it's also probably not good policy because it means that you're simply tying your hands from being able to interact with important political actors around the region. And in that sense, I think it's been unhelpful when regional governments have tried to do the same thing. And I think it's shown that it's sort of backfired in a way because it's attempted to simply paint all of these movements with the same brush without actually making any kind of distinction. So it's usually helpful to know a little bit more about the things that we're trying to ban. Yeah.
Last question, yes.
Abdullah, I mean, is the Muslim Brotherhood strictly an Arab Islamic movement? I mean, the largest percentage of the world's Muslims now live outside the Arab world. To what extent has it addressed that? Has it sought to look at Muslims in South Asia, Southeast Asia, where the largest numbers really are and will continue to be in the coming decades?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think this is exactly the point, is that it really does view itself as an Arab movement. It doesn't think that it has much to learn from many of the experiences of other Islamist trends, whether it's the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan or whether even the AK Party experience was a very recent thing, right? It was only after Turkey emerges as this important regional power that finally the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt sort of has to humble itself to go to Turkey and say, let's learn from this experience. But it certainly wasn't something that they were doing earlier on in their history, at least going back to the kind of 1980s and 90s. And in that sense, I do think that this is exactly the point, that it styles itself as an Arab movement. There are no chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood beyond the Arab world. And so in many ways, it is rooted in that kind of Arab interpretation of kind of Islamic identity that goes back to the kind of late Ottoman era and the kinds of intellectual movements that it traces itself to. While it sort of picks and chooses on occasion of intellectuals and people that it reads outside of it, including Maududi himself and Erbakan and others from Turkey. I mean, they sort of cherry pick some of these texts, but for the most part, it's a very deeply rooted Arab movement, which I think is yet another one of the kind of critiques that have been offered. Yeah.
Abdullah, I have one last question. When the book is finished, will you come back and share with us the results of your research at that point?
Sure, I'd love to.
Perfect.
Thank you
we
so
have
much.
Witnesses here. Join me in thanking Abdullah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.